Hello, everyone. This is Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Webinars. I want to welcome you all to our session, How to Fight Digital Payments Fraud with a Network-Based Approach. My featured speaker today is John Paquette. He is the head of customer success at TIS in the US. TIS is a key partner for this year's 2021 Treasury and Finance Virtual Forum. They were also a key partner last year. They have been a key partner of mine for the past several years, and they share my strong commitment to thought leadership to empower the career success of Treasury and Finance professionals. John is one of my favorite speakers and one of my favorite co-speakers. So John, the floor is yours, my friend. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Ernie, and thanks to everybody for joining our session today on how to fight digital payment fraud with a network-based approach. We'll take you through all aspects of fraud prevention today, explaining some of the threats in the market, what to keep an eye on, what to look out for, and really some strategies that you can put in place to combat fraud within your organization. Before we jump into the topic, just a quick introduction of myself. As Ernie mentioned, I'm the head of customer success for TIS's US market. I'm responsible for our solutions architects team, client onboarding, and some of our partner engagement functions as well. I've been with TIS since 2019, and really prior to that, all of my experience was in the Treasury practitioner space. 15 years supporting Treasury and finance organizations before making the jump over to the technology side. So happy to kind of present both sides of the equation today for you guys as it pertains to fraud mitigation, both from the practitioner and what the technology providers are doing today to give organizations some good strategies to combat that. So before we jump into the topics, not a need to spend too much time here. I think most people these days, they know the numbers well. They know that fraud is top of mind for most organizations, but I think it's pretty telling, the last two statistics over here on the right-hand side, that 85 to 90% of organizations have actually experienced a fraud attempt within the past year, and that 85% of organizations have seen that the threat of fraud has significantly increased year over year, right? So there's a big recognition within the market of the risks that are in place today for fraud, the amount of attacks that organizations are seeing on a day-to-day basis, and certainly something that we are hearing a lot from our customers today in terms of looking for strategies to combat fraud. Just in terms of the types of fraud that are out there, and really what types of organizations are being, or what parts of the organization are being impacted by those fraud threats. As you can see by these pie chart down here on the bottom left-hand corner, across the board, no one's immune, but predominantly 61% accounts payable is the perception as the most vulnerable department within the organization, and 8% for procurement and sourcing, really the individuals who are managing the vendor onboarding process. They're also seen as being vulnerable to fraud attempts, and I think that speaks volumes to the types of attacks that organizations are seeing today. The so-called fake invoice and fake wire instruction change requested attacks that we're seeing more commonly too, which we'll talk about a bit more in a couple slides here. And then still Treasury, they fall right there at 13%, where most Treasury organizations are seeing some level of fraud threat as well. Obviously, the biggest department initiating manual payments is Treasury, and the so-called business email compromise attacks, the fake CEO email spoof attacks that request wire transfers from Treasury, those are still out there, right? Most Treasury teams are still seeing those on a pretty frequent basis, but really some of these new emerging threats are targeting accounts payable and procurement and sourcing are a lot more scary, particularly to most organizations. So what can you do as far as protecting yourself against fraud attacks? Well, we really think of it as there being three components of an effective fraud mitigation strategy. There's your awareness creation. That's really being aware of the threats in the market, which I hope to help you do today a little bit. Having a fraud prevention mindset too, right? So the entire organization having a buy-in towards this being a priority, as well as your training programs, right? Just sort of making people aware, particularly those in payment initiating roles or AP type roles, of the fraud threats that are out there in the market. And then you have your preventive measures. So these are your financial controls, your segregation of duties, user access, the things that you do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that you have controls over your critical financial processes, and more commonly your payments processes, right? And it also goes in a bit into what kind of technology you're using, I guess, to really be able to enable these preventive measures, which I'll get into a bit as we progress through the presentation too. And then the third one here is fraud detection. So this refers more to your more modern fraud detection capability solutions, those that use things like pattern recognition or AI to more proactively flag suspicious transactions, and almost act as a safety net, right? Catching those transactions before they go out the door for one last review to be able to detect if they're actually fraudulent transactions. So you do need all of them, and we'll talk a bit about each one of these in detail as we go through the next few slides here. So first of all, for awareness creation, The most common fraud attacks that we're seeing these days really fall into one of three categories. You have your fake invoice attempts. This is, where criminals are impersonating your vendors. They're sending in invoices that look like real invoices, but they actually have fraudulent wire instructions on them, so that when these payments get into your AP department, they look like business as usual, right? It's one payment that drops into a batch of 150 other transactions, but the destination of that payment, the beneficiary account, is actually a fraudulent account. So that's one form of fraud we're seeing pretty commonly these days. The second are the so-called man-in-the-middle attacks, where things are being intercepted, or the criminals are figuring out a way to interject themselves into the normal day-to-day processes, particularly of the AP and vendor onboarding functions within an organization. So they might submit something that is a fake wire instruction change request, stating that they are so-and-so vendor. They've moved their account from Bank of America to Citibank. Can you please update your records? And if the organization is fooled by that, obviously the next time an invoice payment goes out to that supposed vendor, it's actually being directed to a fraudulent account, right? So we're seeing these pretty commonly these days. We're also seeing the fraudsters actually hacking the supplier's email accounts as well. So when you receive these emails, they're coming from a legitimate email. They look even that much more real, right? But they're still directing you to change your wire instructions to something that's actually a fraudulent account. So very scary here. In terms of these man-in-the-middle attacks for risk for organizations. And then the third one is internal fraud, right? So even with proper segregation of duties within an organization, you can still have collusion, right? Two individuals getting together, updating wire instructions for a particular supplier within your vendor master to a fraudulent account or to one of their accounts, and then executing a transaction through the normal rails within an organization that ultimately is fraudulent too, right? So that's another one that we're seeing here. I'd say number 1 and 2 are probably the two most common that we're seeing most organizations these days look to protect themselves against. And if you think about them, they're really simple attacks. They can be illustrated with a couple of just comics here that I've put together for this particular slide. They use publicly available information, things like LinkedIn or Zoom info, to be able to identify certain individuals that might have the ability to move money or influence payments in the future through putting invoices into AP. And really, they're just banking on there being a certain degree of manual intervention in that process, and that the environment is chaotic or unstructured enough that when something does slip in to the system, it won't be detected before it actually becomes a fraudulent loss, right? So simple attacks executed in high volumes to departments that are already dealing with very high volumes on a day-to-day basis, right? So, and if they're so simple, why are they so difficult to really defend against? And that's where you get into the preventive measures type aspect of fraud prevention. So the thing is that, as simple as the attacks themselves are, the organizations are complex. From an organizational structure standpoint, you have multiple different departments involved in the payment initiation process. You have AP, purchasing, the invoice approval functions, the Treasury departments, a lot of different areas for entry for the fraudsters. And you also have these functions occurring over multiple different geographies, maybe in a shared service model or in a decentralized sort of structure, right? So that's one level of complexity. The second is the amount of systems involved in these processes as well, right? So most organizations, big global organizations, are using multiple different ERPs to manage their vendor masters and their AP processes. Treasury is using Treasury systems for certain payments. HR systems even are in scope, right? So a lot of different systems really where payments can originate from. And then most organizations are using multiple different banking partners as well to execute these payments globally that all have different regulations. Some might be connected for straight through processing. Some might be, having payments performed manually or through some sort of upload process, but really no, unique protocol across all these different banking partners. It differs system to system and bank to bank. And this makes things kind of complex for organizations in actually implementing financial controls or their overall payment approval processes. I'd say most treasurers that we speak to, they have a really good idea in terms of what their payment approval process should be, but actually, putting that into practice, having that be more than something that's just on paper is a difficult thing to do because of these organizational structures. So the first thing we recommend you do is to find something that allows you to administer those controls that you have in place, right? So if you have something like the left-hand side here, multiple different systems using multiple different methods to initiate payments in multiple different ways, like we talked about before, there's no way, obviously, to put in place a consistent approval process across your organization, have the same individuals involved in that payment approval process, have good visibility on what's flowing through the organization on a day-to-day basis, and minimize the human intervention aspect of it, right? It's all different. It's system specific or region specific, whatever it might be. And that becomes something that's very, very, very hard to control. And that's exactly what the fraudsters are looking to introduce themselves into. But if you put in place a simpler overall architecture where there's just one unique entry point to those banking partners, like what you see over here on the right-hand side, that simplifies things immensely, right? It takes the variability and control that's available in those systems, the ERPs or other back office systems, and allows you to put a point of control at payment initiation, right? And it also provides that visibility that you need over the process and facilitates those technology improvements, the straight through processing, the elimination of manual intervention in those payment processes. So this is a good first step. Definitely when you're assessing a technology solution that's going to help you mitigate fraud risk before you even get into any of those more sophisticated fraud detection type solutions, just taking care of what we think of as really the fundamentals here, right? And just a couple other pointers in terms of if you're looking for technology specific for preventive measures for these control aspects, what else should you look for? There's really three other categories that we think are important for organizations to consider here. So security, how is your user management going to be performed on these new systems? Does it allow you to put in place things like principles of least privilege, which is critical for fraud mitigation, right? The amount of damage that can be done with one set of stolen credentials is minimized greatly if you only reduce the scope of entitlements to very specific things for those individuals. So multi-factor authentication, obviously, right? And even an automated user management with integration to your identity management system. So that when individuals leave your organization, they're automatically deactivated from all the payment initiation applications, right? So that whole process becomes automated. It's not a quarterly review as it is for most Treasury organizations these days. And then just secure movements of data through certificate authentication before you move anything, confirming who's, the two systems are what you're expecting them to be. They form that digital handshake, so to speak, before they pass any information back and forth, and that data flows through in an encrypted way. So if it is intercepted, it's essentially useless, right? So, and then likewise, I talked about this a bit on the previous slide, but allowing you to standardize your processes is absolutely critical as well, right? You want to, first of all, get to straight through processing, minimize human intervention, because as we talked about on the fraud threats themselves, that's exactly what the fraudsters are looking for: human intervention in process. Abnormal processes or unique processes for specific systems, and kind of the opportunity to interject themselves into those processes. So by eliminating that, by putting in place a simplified bank connectivity model that eliminates a lot of those barriers that probably prevented you from getting to straight through processing to begin with, that's key as well for this process. And then overall, just facilitating the standardization of your controls, your payment initiation processes, so that across all regions, all payment initiating departments within your organization, you have consistent approval processes. And this makes things immensely more simple, obviously, because instead of having multiple different unique payment approval processes, you can just put together one organizational wide agreed on payment approval process, and put that in place across all of your departments universally. And then likewise, control, right? So you have your segregation of duties, your multi-level approvals and things like that implemented directly in the system, so that you always have two individuals involved, but the two right individuals, and even at different thresholds. So, for example, maybe for anything business as usual, AP batches under $5 million, so to speak, right? You want two local individuals approving those transactions, but if anything abnormal has happened, say batches that surpass the typical limit that you'd see those different departments execute, you can put in place a higher level of visibility, maybe control at the corporate treasury level, right? So this is just the beginning, kind of scratching the surface of being able to really start to detect any sort of abnormalities. But this is really what technology solutions can bring to the table for fraud preventive measures if implemented correctly. So, and then the last kind of aspect here that we talked about was fraud detection. So these are your more intelligent solutions that are able to proactively detect fraudulent transactions. This is a lot of the most exciting stuff that's coming to market these days, particularly for treasury professionals, and being able to leverage actual AI and intelligent softwares to kind of act as a safety net within their transactional processes. So why are these necessary? Why is just awareness and your preventive controls not enough to combat fraud? And it's really just because of the volume that organizations are dealing with. Going back to that first slide that we looked at here with the statistics for fraud volumes, you saw that most organizations would agree that fraud is increasing, right? 85%. This is becoming a day-to-day, week-to-week type dealing for most Treasury organizations and finance organizations these days. And the attacks themselves that are most common are attacking the high volume processing centers. So you have fake invoice attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, going into AP and procurement, departments that are just processing hundreds, thousands of invoices on a day-to-day basis, onboarding new vendors, and these attacks just look like business as usual, right? So, and you also have exposure, so many different points of exposure with these attacks, whether it be at the invoice input level, at the vendor management level, at the manual payment level, internally within the organization, that there's a lot to safeguard here in these processes. So essentially, it could be impossible to really mitigate all those different risks with just preventive controls. And even if you had a perfect process in place, there could still be some level of inherent risk in the process just due to the amount of transactions you're processing on a day-to-day basis and the amount of threats coming into the organization. And this is really where fraud detection comes in and provides a really nice safety net that complements a fraud mitigation strategy. To implement a solution like this effectively, first of all, you can't ignore the first two pillars that we talked about, the first two components. You need to understand the fraud threats in the market, right? So specifically, how does the intelligence solution, how does the fraud detection solution deal with things like fake invoice attacks and fake wire instruction change requests, right? You need to make sure the solution fits the threat. And then you need to understand where the internal control deficiencies exist. What exactly are you trying to protect against? What's that last mile of risk that you couldn't plug through, just normal financial controls and the implementation of some technology that might help you administer those controls, right? And then from there, that's when you really get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, out of a intelligent fraud detection solution. And the last one here is probably the most important, is that you need a holistic data set for these tools to run on top of. Any sort of intelligent fraud solution that's looking at payment patterns or history and things like that, it needs all that. It relies on all that data. The more data it has, the smarter it is, and that data not only pertains to Treasury data like payment activity, but also supplier databases, right? Your supplier master, even some specific compliance type information and checks that need to be done in the course of the payment process. So the more robust that data set is, the better the solution is really going to be. And then once you do have a solution, or you are assessing a solution, you should kind of think of it in terms of the different areas of weakness where you could potentially detect fraudulent transactions, and really how you envision the system to work on a go-forward basis. So I have a diagram here where essentially the transaction screening, the fraud prevention solution is acting as a firewall, a safety net between the sources of payment initiation and the ultimate communication to the banking partners, right? And so from that respect, the solution should be able to screen payments that really come from any source, any of your ERPs or back office systems, treasury management systems, manually initiated payments that are still uploaded, for processes and things like that. It needs to be really system agnostic and able to plug into that process holistically to protect the organization across the board, right, from fraud threats in a really standardized way. Second, most of these tools rely on payment history. But that's not a perfect measure, obviously, because there are new vendors being added all the time to your vendor master, or you may just not have a robust enough payment history to a particular vendor to be able to detect patterns and abnormalities in your payment activity. And so a lot of solutions these days are also able to detect changes in your vendor master, for example, right? So that if there were, say, updates to the vendor master that looked abnormal within the course of the last 3 months, maybe that's a proxy to be able to detect that potentially the organization could have fallen victim to a fake wire instruction change request or a fake invoice request. And you capture the transaction as abnormal based on that criteria versus payment history alone. The third one here should be a holistic screening solution. Everybody always thinks about fraud prevention, but there's a lot of different screenings need to happen within your process, and it just makes sense to put them all in one place and have them all done in one unified way. So there's regulatory screening that a lot of organizations want to do, so that you're monitoring against things like the OFAC list for potential sanctions violations. There's company-specific block lists and safe lists that you want to review against, so to speak, right? So, or industry-specific. There might be an industry-specific list of don't pay beneficiaries that you also want to incorporate into your fraud prevention process. Or you might want to put in place a list of risky countries that you don't want to make payments to, and you want to flag those transactions. These are other considerations, I guess, in terms of the screening activity. And then obviously there's also the fraud screening as well, that is able to look at abnormalities in the payment activities and use a couple of different detection capabilities as called out here in number 4. But the important thing here to keep in mind is utilizing a solution has a lot of different ways to detect fraud. So you have your rule-based scans that might look at things like, you've never paid that vendor before, or you're paying that vendor in a different currency than you typically would pay that vendor in. You're also looking at solutions that have AI and pattern recognition capabilities that are able to tell if your payment activity is following a different pattern than it typically would. Are you paying a certain vendor a lot more frequently than you certainly will, than you typically would? And then community screening parameters as well, right? In terms of being able to leverage beyond just your data set, but maybe the data set of an entire community to more proactively detect fraudulent transactions. And then the last component of detection capabilities that a lot of these solutions have are third-party validations, so that you're looking at an actual third-party source of data where certain beneficiary accounts and beneficiaries have been validated. And the purpose of having a lot of different detection capabilities is, yes, to have a robust fraud detection capability built into the system itself, but also to give you a lot of different flags you can use to prevent false positives. A lot of the biggest burden in implementing a fraud detection solution is figuring out who's going to be involved in the workflow queue to decision all the false positives on a day-to-day basis. And the more rules you have to set, the more specific you can get about the screening parameters, the less you're going to have to deal with false positives on a day-to-day basis. And then fifth here is, it needs to be integrated into your normal payment process, right, through workflows, controls, and alerts, so that as payments are initiated in the course of normal business, people can make decisions on those false positives. There's nothing worse than holding up the payment process unnecessarily, right? And certainly if that was what the tool accomplished, then it would not have very broad organizational support. So something that allows that to be those items to be decisioned and actioned on a day-to-day basis within the normal payment approval workflow in a way that's simple. That's something definitely to look for as well. And then the last one is that you can get lost in all the screening capabilities here, how robust these solutions can get in terms of being able to detect abnormalities. But at the end of the day, it also needs to allow you to complete the payment process, right? So passing through the files that are detected as not abnormal, and then also forwarding forward the false positives once they've been approved, so that those files can actually be executed by the banking partners through whatever connectivity strategy you have in place, whether that be using a Treasury aggregator or Swift Service Bureau or direct connectivity to your banking partners. It needs to be agnostic on that end of the equation as well, right? So definitely some things to keep in mind. Obviously, these tools, like I said before, they're really exciting. They're providing a lot of benefit to Treasury organizations, and they're probably one of the most interesting things that have come to market in a long time. But there are considerations when implementing them to make sure that you get the most out of these solutions. So hopefully you found that insightful. We have just a handful of lessons learned here to just kind of summarize some of the key topics that were discussed during the course of the presentation here. So first of all, like I said, fraud prevention is a mentality that runs through the entire organization, or it needs to be, at least, in order to be successfully implemented. I think everybody probably knows if there's not broad organizational buy-in around something and it hasn't universally been acknowledged as important, it's tough to make any sort of headway on that topic whatsoever, right? So that's a key first step to make sure organizationally everybody's aligned on those particular topics. And then foundational controls, very important in the fraud mitigation strategy, right? So this is what's going to get you most of the way there for preventing the normal day-to-day types of fraud that occur. And so really the key takeaway here is to seek out technology that enables that. For most organizations, the payment initiation processes, the invoice approval processes, the vendor onboarding processes, they're too complex to handle this without a good technology that really, enables the facilitation of the controls that they've already decided that they should have organizationally. AI solutions are a critical component of a fraud mitigation strategy. You're going to get the most bang for your buck if you understand the first two first. You understand the threats themselves that you want to address through an AI solution, an intelligent fraud detection solution. And you also understand that last mile of risk that you can't mitigate through normal financial controls. And I gave you some, I think, quite a few different criteria to look for an AI solution in terms of putting in place something that is providing the benefits that you had expected, right? In terms of being able to be additive to the process and not just result in actioning endless false positives on a day-to-day basis. But these solutions are great. I mean, they definitely have their place in an organization's fraud mitigation strategy, and I think they'll be broadly adopted over the next year or so. And then don't underestimate the power of training. This is your highest impact, low cost method for fraud mitigation. Training, you're having a common training program amongst your entire employee base is absolutely critical. People need to be aware of the threats in the market, what they look like, what form they come in at. And based on that, they're in a much better position to act if they do see those threats, and they know who to alert if they do see them as well. And then the last piece here is that the fraud threats are always evolving. Even since my time leaving the practitioner space, moving to the technology space, the threats in the market are a lot different today than, even in the course of a couple of years than they were back then. So this is ever changing. It's never a one and done. You never put in place a fraud mitigation strategy and then say, okay, I've addressed fraud. I can check that box. You're constantly kind of benchmarking your strategy against the threats in the market, and even organizationally how your processes look. So this is something that requires continuous attention and constant improvement. And so with that, we're at the end of our presentation here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope I gave you some good strategies in terms of how to combat some of the fraud threats that the market is seeing today. But if you want to discuss this topic any further, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John, for your tremendous expertise and insights. I want to encourage everyone to visit the TIS virtual booth in the exhibit hall. A lot more amazing content around fraud and FBAR and harmonizing your payments. Also, I want to once again thank TIS as a key strategic partner of mine in the 2021 Treasury and Finance Virtual Forum. As always, everyone, I appreciate your support of what we're doing. Knock on my door and I'll answer it, and make the rest of your day great, everyone.